Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, the epic clash between the Knightmare and the Iron Wolf leaves both Freelanders and Edarans reeling, struggling to make sense of the aftermath. What awaits Meridia among the smoldering remnants of the new city stronghold? Find out next on the Seventh Valkyrie.
Chapter 37. Relentlessly, the sun rises. Meridia, the 22nd day of winter. Late morning. When the first rays of dawn began to light the nighttime sky, Meridia had ordered the continuation of the evacuation out into the countryside. Now, the smoke of cook fires burning in refugee encampments rose all across the rugged terrain. Some reserve forces remained to hold against any dawn surprises, guarding the last staircase and the remnants of the bridge. But while spotters along the walls continued to report sightings of rampant thwarps burning and rioting along the lower levels, the battle had finished. Like the Edarans, the thwarps had taken deep losses, and with the Knightmare dead and their all-out push to secure the new city repelled by the return of the Iron Wolf, the thwarps had retreated for now. In other circumstances, it might have been prudent to explore a surprise push into the city right now, when it would be least expected. But as flames and unnatural forces continued to rock the lower levels of the new city, which were now under Freelander control, Meridia had neither the desire nor the fighting force for another attack. Stupid ideas were unexpected for a reason. She would leave the reconquering for the force from Mandus, which would have been well on its way in the absence of communications from Reen. The Machine King's thorough dismantling of the new city army, his effortless manipulation of their communication systems, and the ease with which he had turned thousands of Mandarian soldiers against their countrymen were all massive concerns to Meridia. There was so much they didn't know about him, about his weapons, his capabilities, just how deeply he had infiltrated Edera and the Freelands. But as the sun began to peak above the mountains, Meridia returned to the central encampment, well beyond the walls of Reen, where a crowd was growing around a temporary command tent, where attendants were preparing a space for audiences. Everyone wanted a piece of acting Commander Firebow, and so the issue of the Machine King had to wait behind a line of ashamed military officers, anxious bureaucrats and business owners, and civilians in the throes of shock and trauma. Each would have to be attended to accordingly, but despite the calls out to her, Meridia only returned a brief wave and salute as she passed the line, heading to a slightly smaller tent behind the large one, which was her heavily guarded personal quarters. She was now not only a war hero, but the ranking officer on the station, and had made several requests that she had to attend to before giving her time to the people of Reen. Dealing with a combination of administrative bullshit and true compassion would be easier if she was comfortable. But even Meridia was surprised at the level of service she received on such short notice. On her orders, a bath had been drawn, and two handsome masseurs, who she had requested half-jokingly, were waiting with heated stones to soothe her aches and pains at double time. Then her attendants, she had attendants now, delivered her a fresh white light corps uniform adorned with the rank insignia of a high commander, though Meridia stopped them short of dressing her. She was only acting commander. Better not to get too used to such luxury. By the time she returned to the central tent, the line had grown even longer, but as she entered from the back, even her other, more specific requests had been heeded. There was a comfortable lounge chair set up for her to sit while she greeted the petitioners. There was a tankard of cold krasa awaiting for her, an attendant ready to refill it on request, and a plate spread with fresh vegetables and dried meats. She felt a brief twinge of guilt enjoying such visible privileges in the aftermath of such loss. But as the stream of petitioners began to file in, she needed every drop of the krasa and 3 refills of her tray to do even a half-decent job without collapsing into a deep sleep, weeping, or throwing something. Every merchant, shipbuilder, guild leader, and local official came to mule and whine for favors, or try to bluster about how without their preferential treatment, the entire economic system of Reen would collapse. They were unique and varied in their explanations, but what all of them had in common were exaggerated declarations of loyalty to the wolf, along with a healthy supply of bowing and scraping to Commander Firebrow, without whose heroic actions and undeniable beauty the city surely would have fallen. The audacity of such men annoyed Meridia, especially when they were taking up places in line next to concerned mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters seeking any hope for the return of their loved ones. To them, Meridia gave hope where she could, and where she couldn't, she did her best to offer kind though truthful words. They would be long forgotten as disbelief or denial turned into despair, but it was better than false hope. Without fail, though, officials, merchants, and traumatized civilians alike would always finish by asking about the wolf. It was either anguished cries demanding an answer for why he had not saved their loved ones, or declarations of great gratitude that he had, and mostly questions and questions and questions about how he had come and why now and after so long, and to her? In between rounds of requests and appointments, Meridia's guards were no better, poking in to ask her what he had looked like, if she'd known that he was coming, why Reen had been chosen, why he had come now. Meridia was careful in her response whenever asked about the wolf. Stories would race further and faster than any truth, and it wasn't like Meridia had much truth to even offer. Why had the Iron Wolf taken so long to arrive? Why hadn't Val done that before? If he had truly been the Iron Wolf the whole time, then what? So in the absence of any certainty, Meridia just made some vague statements about how Edaran bravery and the thwart threat had inspired him to return to his watch and save them all. It wasn't really enough to push the stories in one direction or another, but people seemed satisfied with the answer. Meridia did her best to answer the questions as long as she could, focusing her energy on what civilians she could offer hope or closure. But she could only listen to so many mules and whines from blustering, bloated office workers, convinced that only their guidance could save the city, before her dwindling supply of fucks to give ran out. Clean up the blood, put on a fresh uniform, and some of them still saw her as a girl playing at being a soldier. That wasn't ideal. It was uncertain how long Meridia would be in charge, and if the merchants thought they could bully her, it would prevent important work getting done. And so, finished with the bullshit, Meridia cut off the most recent merchant mid-sentence and announced a new wartime tax, which would be levied on everyone who'd held up the evacuation and would be used to fund the rebuild and compensate families who had lost loved ones. Then, she got up and ordered her attendants, clerks, and office workers to begin compiling those lists from gate guardsmen, and then announced that she was leaving for a run to survey the woods. There was a storm of protest from the clerks and the merchants and the officers as she walked out of the front door and began to run. But there had been no one on base that could keep up with her training runs when they'd been healthy. So now, after a night of terror and fear, even the most dedicated clerk fell behind her quickly, and their voices had faded long before they could finish explaining how exactly she was derelicting her duties. Her route out into the woods initially took her into the forested trails that marked the edge of the forest, where she traced the edge of the eastern wall at the top of the new city, which lay untouched. That matched her reports, which had consistently shown the lack of any Freelander presence east of the wall in the new city woods. But strangely, that put Meridia on edge. Only when she was certain that no one was watching at her north warp, she veered deep into the woods, heading towards the clearing where she had met the false wolf. Meridia turned the title over in her head as she ran. Part of her still doubted that he was truly the Iron Wolf, but the man who she had called Val and False Wolf was a hero, and the most dangerous warrior she had ever encountered. Whoever he was, To call him simply false wolf did not do him justice. Part of Meridia doubted that she'd find him at the same meeting place. He was maddeningly careful, and if he didn't want to be found, it would be nigh on impossible for Meridia to locate him out here. Maybe he was waiting, crouched around some bush, watching her, ready to jump out at any moment and gloat, or simply let her run around in the woods until she tired herself out. And it was only because all of her senses were alight for any sign of Val that she noticed the cries of scavengers and carrion birds just before she descended towards the stream that would take her to the meeting place. Against the quiet whisper of the winter woods, that much crying and screeching would be noticeable for a mile around, attracting animals, thwarps, and possibly the wolf Meridia was seeking. Slowing first down to a careful jog, Meridia turned towards the clamor, heart beating faster as she slipped through the woods on high alert. When she crested a small hill, the call of the scavengers suddenly grew louder again. It would shield the sound of her approach, sure, but it would also hide the sound of anyone watching. Was she walking into a trap? Drawing her weapons, Meridia slowed again, creeping from skeletal tree branches along piles of leaf litter, crawling under fallen logs, and finally dragging herself through the first flurried snowbanks on the ground until she crested another ridge, poking her head free towards where the carrion birds squabbled with the scavengers, and finding herself eye to eye with the growling expression of a Uveran thwarp. A knife flashed twice, and congealed blood spurted out onto the scattered snow and dirt, and only as Meridia gagged the Uveran with her hand and stabbed him over and over to hasten his death did she realize that she was far too late. Though his eyes were open and his expression fierce, his midsection was torn to shreds, and he had died long ago. Meridia's flashing blade had only succeeded in splattering her new uniform with blood. That would be inconvenient, but not her biggest problem right now. Out beyond the ridge, the carrion birds and scavengers continued to screech, and discarding the eviscerated body, Meridia crept over the edge of the ridge, surveying the remnants of a massacre. The smoldering ashes of scattered cook fires still breathed smoke into the air, and woven among them were the carrion birds and the scavengers, fighting over a mess of bodies and flesh drenched in whatever blood hadn't yet sunk into the dirt. What the fuck happened? In her time as an investigator in Mandus, she'd encountered horrifying crime scenes, but never one quite like this. Bodies lay scattered on one side of the clearing. Then there was a gap, and then the bodies fell in ones and twos, spreading out in an expanding trail that led out of the clearing and into the woods, away from the city. Meridia carefully retreated beyond the edge of the ridge, keeping an eye on the clearing, but saw no movement except the scavengers fighting over scraps that had been human once. Following the zigzagging trail of bodies deeper into the forest, she found no further signs of life, only longer trails of blood, and 3 or 4 tangles and thickets where piles of bodies had attracted hungering beasts of all sizes. Meridia dove away towards cover, checked her angles, and then moved in, sliding towards the sound of the voice, which had come from a tangle of massive tree branches, grown so thick together she couldn't see through them. Timing her movements so that she was concealed by the shrieks of the scavengers, Meridia followed the sound and finally discovered someone who was technically alive. The raspy wheeze came from a Uveran woman, impaled in every direction by roots, thorns, and branches, and more than a dozen had punched clean through, and now held her nearly motionless, apart from the faintest rise and fall of her chest. What happened to you? Who did this? The Uveran's eyes flashed open. They were filled with blood and zipping around frantically, and even though Meridia stood a mere 6 feet from her, there was no recognition in the woman's eyes. The Uveran began to thrash. The woman's wheezing cry fell into the terrified gurgling of blood, and then with her last throes she lay dead. But she had said enough. Nimrasa, the Night Hunter. That was why there had been no attacks beyond the eastern wall. Hey there! If you're hearing this, it means you're listening to the public version of this episode. I appreciate you taking the time and your interest in the series. It really helps the algorithm, it helps us grow. But if you are enjoying the show, maybe take a look over at our Patreon. We have uncut versions of the early episodes, access to new chapters before they're released for the general public, and you can shape the future of the series by deciding on new merch drops, bonus content, and more. You can get started for free at patreon.com/Seventh Valkyrie. That's patreon.com/7THVALKYRIE. Hope to see you there.